I'm hearing some thunder rumbling out my window, so hopefully it won't be anything serious where the power loss. We're having some remnants of a tropical depression that's moved through, so I'm sure some of you other folks around the state are getting this as well. Thanks for joining us today for this informative webinar. You all know we're in the midst of some very challenging and scary times. I think this is something none of us ever felt we would ever face, that we basically are having to shut down programs and work from home and cover our face and really live in fear, just really getting out about our business. You know, sometimes I watch the news and it seems to sound like it's beginning to get a little encouraging. And then the next day I hear something that's this discouraging. So, you know, who knows what our future holds. Right now in Montgomery, we're a hot spot. I think we've surpassed Jefferson County for active cases of the virus. Our day programs, as you know, have been closed for 3 months, but we've got to figure out a way to, you know, get back to somewhat of a normal routine, because our funding will not allow us to, you know, for retainer payments forever. So there is some work going on. As many of you probably on the call are participating in a work group, trying to put some things in place to begin to consider how we can safely bring our programs back into operation. So hopefully you're getting some information from some of your colleagues, if you're not getting it directly, on how that, you know, is beginning to look. Fortunately, we had already been working with our consultants that are on the call today, Tom Wiles and Genni Sasnett, for the past probably about 5 years now. Really bringing some expertise to Alabama on how our agencies, our day programs especially, could maybe look at a new business model, getting away from those traditional facility kind of settings to supporting people more out in their communities. And of course, HCBS was driving that as well, even more. And then oops, along comes the COVID-19 virus. And now we're all scrambling and panicking, not only in Alabama, but nationwide. So how do we really continue to support people and deal with the scare of the COVID virus? I want to thank, of course, the SLN State Employment Leadership Network today for hosting us, and Suzanne and her colleagues that are part of this process today. Their expertise and experts, I know that. Suzanne is very tech savvy. Unfortunately, I am not the employment specialist in Alabama. We're trying to get, or some of them, not myself, but Derek and Virginia and Jennifer are trying to become experts on some Zoom, on the Zoom app, so we can maybe offer more in-state things in the future. So as Suzanne mentioned, we have a second webinar scheduled tomorrow, and we'll mention that again towards the end. And we have an interactive workshop scheduled on June the 23rd, and there'll be a formal announcement coming out for that, where we'll actually want you to register for that particular workshop. Tom and Genni, again, will be able to give you some excellent information today, but they're probably going to tell you, just like I mentioned earlier, right now, I don't think anyone has the answers to this crisis, but I think some of the information that they provide will be helpful to you as you and your organization try to move forward. So without taking up any additional time, back to you, Suzanne.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we are so pleased to be able to join together with Genni and Tom. And so we will just do a quick introduction here and ask them to say a little bit more of their background. I know many of you may already be familiar with Genni and Tom from work that they've been doing throughout Alabama. They're gaining a great foundation of really what makes your system tick, and understanding what your goals are and how to take their experiences and translate that into some useful concepts for really seeing yourselves as taking on leadership roles to be that change that you are aiming for. So Genni and Tom, welcome, and we'd love to hear what you'd like to share today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Happy to have you here, and hopefully everything will work perfectly for us today, and we will have a good session. There's a couple things I wanted to say before we get started, and the first is this. You know, we always are speaking to crowds of people that we're not sure the level of knowledge and experience of the entire body of people. So today we are starting with talking about foundations for change, about seeing ourselves as change agents, because it is incredibly important for all of us, and particularly our direct support staff, to understand the importance of their role in society and in societal change. If we don't have that under our belts, if we don't understand how these changes have been coming for a long time and how they have brought us to this point and where they're going to take us from here, that's a disadvantage for people. So today we're really going to focus a lot on that deep understanding. How did we get to where we are today? How are we going to move forward? Tomorrow, we will have more of a nuts and boltsy kind of conversation about how to do certain things. And as Byron made clear, people keep asking us how people should get back to work and back to the day programs, et cetera, all across the nation. And there's no easy answers already developed for those, but we will give some ideas for that. Again, I'm Genni Sasnett. I'm a native Alabamian, as many of you know. And I am a consultant. I was many years ago a classroom teacher. That's how I started my career. I left that work and went on to be a manager at a shelter workshop for a number of years. Left that work and went on to work with adjudicated and at-risk youth, and finally found my home, which was St. John's Community Services. And those of you who've been watching the protest in Washington this past week have seen St. John's, because it is the big yellow church right across from the White House. That church founded our organization. Our organization spun off of it a number of years ago and became non-sectarian, but we remained very close to the church. So all of this activity at St. John's is very relevant to us. But at any rate, I continued in my role there at St. John's for 30 years as the COO. During my tenure and Tom's tenure, we managed to convert a very traditional organization to a 100% facility-free one. We will talk more about that. And subsequent to our retirement, we have both become consultants. I work for ODEP as well as for a number of individual states. And I have been a consultant for ICI for at least 5 or more years as well. So I am colleagues with these folks from ICI. And I'll turn it over to Tom.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm the old guy here, I think. I've been in the field for over 50 years and started in the early history of services to people with disabilities. I was a back ward attendant at State Hospital in St. Louis, psychiatric aide, special ed aide, became a special ed teacher, moved to Texas, became a voc rehab teacher, moved on and became a trainer for Public Law 94-142 and integrating kids into the public school system with disabilities. Worked for Head Start and did integration on a national level of training teachers to provide opportunities for disabled children. And then I too found my home at St. John's and was the president and CEO of the agency that evolved in our time there from a very small school. And we'll talk about how we did that tomorrow, into a agency that was in 5 states, had, I believe, 9 corporations, and grew significantly. When we retired, we were both recruited by the Department of Labor to provide technical assistance for the transition of agencies into providing services in community-based settings. So in the last 5 or 6 years or so, we've been pretty much all over the country working directly with providers like yourself. And I'm proud that we are you. We were providers, and we faced all the challenges that you do. And challenges are surmountable. if you work as a team and define where you're going. So we're going to basically, as Genni said, today talk about why and what is it that everyone's asking you to do. So when Genni came up with this slide, it's been a long time coming. I heard a Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young song playing in the background. What we're asking you to do of being out in the community, a lot of people may be threatened, see overwhelming challenges, but this just didn't happen overnight. This has been a long time in coming. Prior to the 1970s, when I started at the St. Louis State School and Hospital as an attendant, there was no right to services. The institution was a last resort. Public schools did not have to provide education. Adult services were not required. And parents relied heavily on charities like that of St. John's, had a private school that accepted children. Or the other alternative was to place your child in a state institution. So things began to change in the 1970s. I mentioned Head Start. That was early on with Public Law 94-142. Public Law 94-142, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, required what the jargon was in the time, FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education, for the very first time for school-age children. And school-age was defined somewhat by each state, but could go up to age 22. And, there was assessments that were mandated, but one of the biggest requirements, which was fairly groundbreaking at the time, was the least restrictive environment. So in 1975, when the law was enacted, children were required to be with non-disabled children as much as appropriate for the first time. With Head Start, 10% of the enrollment opportunities had to be available to children with disabilities. About the same time came deinstitutionalization. And I saw the horror firsthand of institutional life when I was locked in wards of 50, 60 people, wall-to-wall beds. There was numerous lawsuits throughout the country that said that such services violated the constitutional rights of these people who were warehoused there. So you had a rash of federal court cases that mandated people be provided community services. And so people started moving out into the community. At the same time, you had Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act that was enacted. And it gave people the first disability civil rights law to be enacted in the United States. And it prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in programs that receive federal financial assistance, and set the stage for the enactment later on of the Americans with Disability Act. In the 80s, things progressed even further. You had the Medicaid waiver programs being instituted for the first time. What happened with deinstitutionalization when ICFs and day programs and sheltered workshops were moving into the community, a lot of the same funding and regulations moved with them into the community. And they were very restrictive, and they were very all-encompassing. Everybody got the same array of services, regardless if you needed them or not. The Medicaid waiver said to states that we will waive all those Medicaid regulations if you can provide community-based services at the same cost or less on average. And so that really opened up a new way of thinking. And now all 50 states engage in waiver programs. They're all a little bit different. So when Genni and I go into states and provide technical assistance to providers, we have to kind of relearn their Medicaid waiver programs and how they work and all the rates. They're all very different. So with the Medicaid waivers in the 80s also came the concept of supported employment. I remember Genni going to a conference in the 80s, and the concept was so brand new. You know, in the institution and even in the program that I was running before I met Genni, it was, we're going to train you, and once you reach certain competencies, we'll eventually place you in a least restrictive environment, be it a group home, or maybe we'll look for a job if you've got all these competencies. The problem was no one ever reached those competencies, that we just continued to hold people back in an institutional setting. And for people like me, who was the CEO, it was actually to my benefit to hold people back, because that was increased tuition for our program. In the 80s, the whole concept turned on its head. It's what are the skills somebody has and what are their interests? And let's match that to a job. So it was, let's place and train. I remember when I was young and in high school and going, looking for a job, I had no idea, you know, I didn't know how to, one of my first jobs was selling shoes. I had no idea how to sell shoes, but the manager took me under his wing and taught me how to do it. So that was the concept of supported employment and being able to provide long-term supports to help people be successful in the community. So let me go on. In the 90s, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that was really groundbreaking. There was two major components to ADA. One was Title I, which required employers with 15 or more employees provide qualified individuals with disabilities equal opportunity to benefit from the full range of employment-related opportunities available to others without disabilities. And then there was Title II in public services, where you couldn't discriminate against people with disabilities. You had to provide full access to all community resources. And then Olmstead in the 90s was the interpretation by the federal courts of ADA. In Georgia, there were two women who were voluntarily committed to one of the state institutions. And in residing there, they decided they wanted community-based services. They didn't want to live in the institution. And the state contended that, you know, they didn't have the resources to do that. And, even though all their assessments said these women could benefit from being in the community, that was denied. The court overruled that decision and said that these women not only wanted, but the state had the resources and the availability to provide community resources, and therefore ordered it. And that was one of the most important pieces of federal litigation for folks with disabilities that there have been, because that really opened the door to the interpretation that services must be community-based for those people who want it and when that's in their best interest. So things keep progressing. In 2000, we moved to customized employment. And that was taking a different look beyond just supported employment. It meant that we could tailor a job to fit the individual needs of not just the person who was looking for employment, of what their interests and skills were, but also tailoring a job to meet unique needs of a business. So, we had concepts like task reassignment, where some of the job tasks of the incumbent workers are reassigned and a new job description is negotiated. A job carving, an existing job description is modified to fit the unique skills of this participant. Job sharing, where 2 or more people would take a job description and divvy it up among people to make that job work for the employer. And then self-employment. What are some of those unique kinds of
you just left a message on my voicemail about an appointment tomorrow. I have an appointment with y'all, so I think you may have a bad number.
There are some unique jobs that people could actually take on themselves. I remember one of the first ones we had was a young man who went into the vending machine business, and he helped install vending machines at different places of business and restocked them and did the change and that sort of thing. And he ended up having his own business. So then we get to 2010. And this is pretty much where we are now and the challenges that you face as providers. First, you have the settings rule. And what the new federal legislation regulations says is that services are to be integrated in and support full access to the greater community. So if you're going to receive Medicaid waiver dollars, they need to be in the community and your participants need to have full access. That it should engage in community life. People should control their own personal resources, receive services in the community the same degree as people not receiving waiver services. Services are, and who provides them is selected by the participant. And maybe one of the most important components of it is we are not going to fund you if the settings have the effect of isolating people from receiving Medicaid funded services from the broader community. So it's really pushing us to get away from this institutional facility-based model, that we need to use the community as our new learning environment. Also in 2010, the Department of Justice had several pieces of litigation against Seattle and Oregon.
No, Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, I'm sorry. And both of them are fairly similar in that the states were channeling folks graduating from school directly into segregated, typically sheltered workshop environments. And in both cases, the courts ruled that they needed to be provided employment services in the community, and typically supported employment, customized employment. So that changed the thinking and the direction of both school systems and adult services. And then we also had WIOLA regulations come out for the Voc Rehabilitation Act, where vocational rehabilitation played a bigger role in adult services, looking for jobs, facilitating competitive integrated employment. And it began to limit providers and states' ability to funnel people into sheltered workshops and sub-minimum wage. You know, they had to address a lot of hurdles before a person was placed in a sheltered workshop. So it was discouraged greatly. And then it also defined customized employment, supported employment, and competitive integrated employment. These are now the conditions that providers need to address and work in, and the challenges are, you know, moving from the facility-based model to a community-based model. If I could just read one thing that was part of the Olmsted decision that I think addresses why. You know, why are we saying people really need to be in the community rather than in this facility-based learning environment? And the United States Supreme Court, in its decision, wrote that confinement in an institution severely diminishes the everyday activities of individuals, including family relations, social contacts, work options, economic independence, educational advancement, and cultural enrichment. So what they found was people should be provided the same access to the community and human rights as the rest of us without disabilities. Jenny?
Thank you. So what I hope you were able to hear and see in Tom's presentation is the progression. That's really the point that we're trying to make with this first part of the presentation, that we have been steadily moving towards this point in time, not the pandemic and not the social unrest, but towards this point in time where there's so much focus on moving towards a community for a very long time. So it's nothing new. Maybe we didn't pick up the ball quickly enough in some cases, but this has been coming for a long time, and it has brought us to where we are today. And today, the 2020s, where lucky me, I get to pick up the presentation, is kind of a tough time. I would say for this decade so far, not so good. We have COVID-19 and all the impacts thereof. We have very significant social unrest and the impacts of that. All of this is causing economic stress. We are facing societal change that is somewhat unpredictable. We're not quite sure what the new norms are going to be subsequent to the pandemic. And we are just facing a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now. Human beings do not like uncertainty. It's one of the things that people are least comfortable with. And yet that's where we find ourselves today. So what I'd like to suggest is that, you know, as these laws have been changing, as expectations have been changing, as our work has been changing, and none of that should be a surprise, it's still a lot to absorb. And I love this Chinese proverb that I found a number of years ago, and I hope that you will embrace it. And it is, when the winds of change blow, some people build walls and others build windmills. And so we need to be those windmills. We need to be those people who continue this march forward that Tom cited starting in the 70s and really started even before them and has brought us to this point today. We need to be the windmills who in a time of change are picking up the ball and running with it, even though it's not the easiest thing in the world. Tom talked a lot about laws, and I think, and I'm sure you all agree, that laws are very important. They are the foundational things that help us govern our society and how we conduct ourselves and what expectations are. But the reality is, laws aren't really what changes culture. Laws can't change culture. They can prescribe behavior, they can prohibit behavior, but they can't change culture. And really the culture is what all of you on the phone, all of us have been trying to work on all these years. And cultural change can be very slow, and it can go forward and then it can regress. We fear in times of unrest and a lot of social change that things will regress. That's why I want you to be a windmill and keep pushing things forward. Cultural change has to be pursued persistently or it does not move forward. And I'll give you some examples of how that occurs. So 55 years ago, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. You're all familiar with the Civil Rights Act. It outlawed discrimination, based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin. And it was obviously a very important landmark law in our country and has had a lot of impact. It's interesting if you read the Civil Rights Act, how much employment was cited and emphasized. And that tells you something, that is saying to you that employment is an important vehicle to move human rights forward, to move civil rights forward, and to have people acquire full citizenship. So actually the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which you're all familiar with, I'm sure, was created as a result of the Civil Rights Act. But that was 55 years ago that the actual law was passed. And so I will ask you, you may answer in chat or you answer in your mind or answer in your soul. Today is June 10th, 2020. Do we believe that the promise of the Civil Rights Act, that law itself, has been kept, or is there more to do? I venture to say that we pretty much are all going to say there's more to do, particularly given what we see happening in our country right now. The law could do certain things, but the cultural change, that is more difficult, and 55 years later, we're still struggling. I'll give you another example. Ladies, 100 years ago, there was a constitutional amendment that gave you the right to vote. Prior to that, you had no right to vote. Often women could not own their own property, nor did their own earnings necessarily always belong to them. Women should have made significant progress in that 100 years since they acquired the right to vote. But I will ask you today, June 10th, 2020, do we believe the promise of the amendment that allowed women the right to vote, do we believe that promise has been fully met? Or do we think there's more to do? I would venture to say there's more to do. And it's made most obvious by looking at the discrepancy in wages between women and men. Women make 80 cents on the dollar to men today. White women make 80 cents on the dollar to men today, 100 years later. Black women, it's something like 65 cents on the dollar. And for Latina women, it's even less. That promise has not been kept. The law was there, but the culture is still catching up. Hence, we have things like the Me Too movement. Hence, we have things like Black Lives Matter. Culture is difficult to change, and it takes time. And that brings me to the ADA. And we all, and Tom spoke about the ADA, and I will not elaborate on it. You know the provisions. The Title I is the employment part, which is so important to us who are committed to employment first in the effort to get people into competitive integrated employment. And then there's Title III, which is important to those of us who work with people in community-based services and having the ability to support people to access the resources of their community. That's a very important title. It's the title that protects people and prohibits folks from being excluded from public places that other people may access. Very important to our community-based day services now. But I will then also ask you, with regard to the ADA, do we think now, today, June 10th, 2020, that the full promise of the ADA has been realized? And I would venture to say, no, it has not, because we still have something like only 35% of people with disabilities who want to work are working. We know that the full promise of the ADA has not yet been met. So we are very much involved in a civil rights movement for people with disabilities. And the important thing to understand, if you go away from today's session with nothing else, is that employment is the most frequently used vehicle or avenue to help people acquire their full civil rights in the society. It is the most important tool to help change culture and change how people perceive each other. Work has what I would call an equalizing effect. We all talk about work. What do you do at work? Where does that person work? Where did you used to work? Where do you hope to work in the future? Work is what we have as a common denominator among many of us, or the vast majority of us. Also, familiarity breeds acceptance. So I might have a bias between a particular group of people, say that was the case. But I really didn't know that group of people. I just had been given a stereotype, and so that's all I knew. And I bought into it, and that's all I knew. But if I work side by side with someone, I'm not seeing them anymore as that stereotypic example of that particular group of people. I'm seeing that person as Bill or Jane or Joan or Bob. I'm seeing them as that person next to me. And so my perception begins to change, not only of that person, but the entire group of people that that person may be representative of. The other part of that is our society is one in which we value productivity. We contribute, people contribute. You work, or you're at home raising kids, or you are a volunteer, but we like contributors in our society. And when we see people with disabilities contributing, whether that be through work preferably, or volunteerism or internship as they're in a preparatory mode, then people start seeing folks differently. They no longer see them as needing, but rather as giving, as producing, as contributing. And economic parity is powerful. If I take one of you out to dinner 5 times, and I pay every time, first of all, I'm a fool, but secondly, that gives me power. I have power. I'm the one with the bucks. I call the shots. But if you pay every other time, now we are on a more equal footing, and we see each other more as peers. So, you know, it is important to me, as one who works with agencies who are trying to make the change that we're talking about and understand the importance of the community to people. It is important that you understand that this really is a civil rights movement, and that those of us who work within this movement are change agents. We are indeed civil rights workers. So what is the implications for all the stuff that we've been talking about for agencies? Well, obviously, competitive and integrated employment is imperative. It is the priority. It is, as I've said many times, a magnificent vehicle to help people acquire their full civil rights. Meaningful community engagement is also imperative, because being in the community and being engaged, again, contributes to that ultimate goal, this perception of perceptual change that we are promoting in society. So we are going to change the way we operate. If you haven't already, you're gonna, because that's the direction things are going. And how we see our work and the job that we do every day, that should change too, because we really do need to embrace the importance of our role in this magnificent cultural change that we are promoting. So you may be saying to yourself, well, geez, that sounds rather lofty, Genni. Exactly what can I do? Well, there's a lot you can do. First and foremost, you should see your role differently. This is not just a job. You are part of a movement, and a very significant movement, to help people with disabilities acquire their full civil rights in this country. And the reality is, if you can become inspired as a staff person, you will make things happen no matter what. And we know this, Tom and I got firsthand experience with this, because when we were in the process of transforming our agencies, and we started that way back in the 80s, we had every obstacle in the world against us. Nobody wanted us to go in the community. People didn't want to pay us anymore. Everybody fought us tooth and nail. And we didn't have any money, the whole 9 yards. But we got passionate. We got inspired as an organization. And then it didn't matter what obstacle you put before us. We were going to do what we thought was the right thing, come heck or high water. So, if it is important that people begin to understand that they're part of a movement, that they become inspired and begin to see themselves as change agents who have the ability to accomplish this magnificent goal that we have before us. So other things that I would encourage you to do are these. One, have expectation. This is sort of, people who know me know this is like my big thing. Have expectations of people. Don't judge people, ruling out all future opportunity. And what I mean by that is, if somebody walks in the door of your agency and you take a look at them, and the first thing that crosses your mind is this person will never work or never be able to be out in the community meaningfully engaged, then you've just destroyed opportunity for that person. And I contend you don't have a right to do that. Your job is to have expectations of people, high expectations. Now, will we accomplish every goal? Will every expectation be met? I don't know. I mean, we don't know. But if we don't have employment as a goal, if we don't have community engagement as a goal, and then we won't provide the preparation. And if we don't provide the preparation, then the person can't progress. So we must have expectations. We must provide appropriate preparation so that people can move ultimately into employment and again become meaningfully engaged in their communities. We have to open our minds and realize that we don't need to be putting people on continuums where they have to struggle through this step, that step, the other step, in order to get in line for community employment. Any service can be used to support a pathway to employment. A desire for employment could be recognized and supported through residential services, through day services, through employment services. We need to be more flexible. As I have said many times, we need to understand that this cultural change is slow, and it begins with changes in entrenched perceptions. And those entrenched perceptions only change through a person having personal experience or being able to make observations. So we have to be in the position to help people be where they can be seen differently, and hence those perceptions change. We have to help people learn to advocate and speak for themselves. And hopefully that's something that we're doing. So, we are lucky. We are lucky people. We don't get paid the best in all of those other things. But what we do have is we do have the power and the ability to raise a whole group of people in society and change societal perceptions. And we can do that through our own behavior and our own advocacy. Yeah, I see staff as messengers, and I hope, that you will see that as well. Because it is the individuals that we are supporting and the staff who are supporting them that are bringing a message to the community and to society. And that message is either one of competence and an ability to work and be engaged, or it's a message of incompetence and a continuation of old perceptions. So, in our staff training, we were very clear with staff, having them understand that they were always observed in the community and that every action they took was a message to those around them, and that they had to be very thoughtful and always respectful, always presenting people in a way that they would be seen as most competent. I think it's an important thing for agencies to be asking themselves, are we doing a good job of preparing our messengers? And exactly what should those messages be? We can't just hire people on and turn them loose in the community and not be confident that they really truly understand what their mission is and the power they have to either forward the movement or to set it back. And nobody surely wants to be in the position to set it back. Staff are role models. The community sees how staff support someone, and it shows them how to act when they encounter someone with a disability. People avoid people with disabilities in some circumstances, not because they don't like them or anything of that nature. People are afraid to be embarrassed because they don't really know how to communicate with somebody. They don't really know how to act. So the easier thing to do is just move away and not even make that attempt. I myself, I have worked most of my career in working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and less with a whole lot of people who were physically impaired. And I can remember, this has been a long time ago, I was so afraid to approach somebody in a wheelchair because I wasn't sure, was I to kneel, was I to stand, was I to touch the chair, never touch the chair. It felt complicated, and I didn't want to do the wrong thing. Me, who's worked in this field, for almost 50 years. So you can imagine a community member, they just don't, it's awkward, and they haven't seen as many people with disabilities in their lifetime as we have, obviously, and they may be confused about how to approach somebody. Staff can model how that is done. And as I said before, and I'll say again because for emphasis, if staff do things to make people look competent, they will be perceived as being competent. If staff do things to make people look incompetent, that's how they'll be seen by others. So sometimes we are actually engineering situations for success, meaning that we need to know the people we support, and we need to know their interest in the things that they would like to pursue. And we need to know the situations in which they would not be very successful, and to some degree engineer things so that we have always a circumstance of the best presentation of the person with a disability. I am an employment first advocate and have been practically my whole career. And I have said a number of times, and I'll say it once more, employment, particularly competitive integrated employment, is that tremendous vehicle that can help change the perception society has of people with disabilities. But that employment has to be well matched to the individual. And I would also say profitable to the employer. Because when we do a poor job match, when we just slam somebody into any old job just to get a placement, then that does not work for that person. That does not work for that individual. That is observed by many, and it sets us back. So we really have to be committed to acquiring the skills and knowledge necessary to do those really fantastic job placements. That's the right job for the person with the right conditions, and it's making everyone successful, the individual as well as the employer. In terms of meaningful community inclusion, let me say this. This can be done well, and this can be done extremely poorly, and I've seen both. The most important thing in Alabama, I'm proud of you for some of your new waiver definitions and the clarity you have in terms of size of groups and expectations, because meaningful community inclusion and engagement simply cannot be achieved in large groups. I've talked to people before that talk about taking people out, 8 folks to 2 staff into the community to participate in activities. Well, you might as well not do that at all. We need to have the kind of arrangement where people can be supported as individually as humanly possible and avoid those large groupings. Meaningful community inclusion also cannot be accomplished by one-shot experiences, endless one-shot experiences. Being involved in the community is not about going someplace new every day, 365 days a year, because a lot of what we're trying to accomplish in our community inclusion activities is the development of relationships. And if I go to a different coffee shop here in Richmond where I live every single day, I won't know anyone, but I go to the same one, and I know the name of the barista, and she knows my name, and we're friends. And so we have a relationship. You also cannot achieve meaningful community inclusion with people who do not believe, with staff who are being dragged screaming and clawing into the community. Because it's a very autonomous job. It is a job that, as I am indicating, carries enormous importance, and it simply has to be done by someone who passionately believes that this is the right thing to do and who has the skill to determine the right amount of support, not too little, not too much, but the appropriate amount that's going to be correct for that person, and again, show them off best in their communities. So we really need to focus on the support we're giving to staff, and I'm a tremendous advocate for our direct support staff. You are nothing agencies without your staff, and the more you move in the community, the more you will understand that. But people who are coming in this field, we're learning some new things that perhaps people hadn't learned before. And one important thing is how to use the community as a classroom or a training location. All you have to do is walk out the door, and you're going to see a million opportunities to teach people about different kinds of jobs they see, different kinds of transportation that's available, safe use of the community, how to access community resources. That is everywhere around you in the community. And so staff need to learn how to take advantage of that. They need to understand how to introduce people to the community and the community to the individuals. And that often comes by not overpowering the individual. I'll say a few more words about that in a second. Also, staff need to be supported to look for teachable opportunities. I always say, if I was out in the community with an individual and nowhere in their ISP or person-centered plan or any place did to say anything about safe crossing of streets, and yet I'm walking with this person and we come to a street crossing with a traffic light, am I going to teach the person about that? Of course I am, because that's a teachable opportunity showing itself to me right then and right there, and I need to know how to take advantage of that. And staff, obviously there are goals and training goals and things that they always have to have in mind, but they need to also understand how to be opportunistic. Even if you were going one direction, you were going to teach one thing today, but you see this wonderful opportunity over here that really would allow you to teach many more things and many more important things. Shift, take advantage of that, be opportunistic. More and more our staff are away from management. They're alone in the community. They need to have the skills and the tools in the old tool bag there so that they can take advantage of what is present. They need to learn how to teach from behind. And this is what I was referring to a bit a minute ago. And what I mean by that is, we have a habit of being on top of our individuals all the time and not allowing them to make unassisted attempts at tasks and experiences. We don't allow initiation. We're in the front of the pack all the time. We're walking into the, grocery store or pharmacy or whatever with individuals with us at the front with our hands out to shake hands. Well, in the old days, shaking hands. We need to step back sometimes and let people initiate, see what they have to show you that you may not be aware of because you've been stepping on it for a while. I think the other thing is failure is okay. Our individuals can fail. It's all right. It won't kill you. And it's especially all right when you have a skilled person, a skilled coach to talk you through the experience. So I think, in summary, before I turn it back to Tom, we need to learn to see the total person. Community integrated employment is the goal. Community, meaningful community involvement is the goal. But, all of the elements of our life are not isolated from each other. And we've learned that so much more during the quarantine and during the pandemic. Our lives are interwoven and best when we can balance things and have work-life balance and have time to pursue our other needs and interests. So we always have to remind ourselves and remind our staff we need to see the total person. And I'll turn it back to Tom.
So, our goal is competitive integrated employment and integrated community engagement. So our staff, our direct service professionals, are our frontline change agents. So what can we do to help support them? Tomorrow we're going to go into much more detail about the entire transition process, but just as a beginning thoughts of what are some very important aspects to the transition process is staff training and development. First, we've got to have the expectations Genni was outlining. We've got to have job descriptions that really reflect those skills, the important aspects of the job of being in the community. I know we went through a whole litany of job titles of community connector, community developer. You can be creative and think of some things titles that really say to the direct service professional, what their job is. You've got to reinforce at every corner, every turn, what the mission and values are of the direct service professional. I know we had a very well thought out mission, and it was plastered everywhere. So staff knew exactly what their role was in the agency. Field-based learning. You can have training, you can do web-based training, a lot, workshops like this that you can show the staff. But one of the key things is having an experienced direct service professional be with your new recruit and showing him the ropes and just how to do it, so they're just not out there on their own winging it all the time. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of that happen. We also provided a lot of training on untraditional topics that would really expand the expertise, the skills of our direct service, like public speaking. We would take them down to city council meetings to do advocacy, just a number of marketing topics. typically we have a slide here with like 30 different topics that are very untraditional: how to negotiate, how to do non-directive counseling, and it goes on and on. And you've got to have good managers who are trained, who actually know the direct service professional's job, who has done it themselves, so that they can be a role model. You've got to have the ability for the managers to be in the field. I know it was eye-opening for me. You know, when we started the transition process, we were totally center-based. And I could walk down the hall and see my teachers, see my managers. Everybody was in the same building. I had to get a schedule to be out in the community and for people to see me and for me to understand what was really going on in the agency and how services were being delivered. So you've got to recreate not only your direct service staff's job descriptions, but you've got to look at your manager's job descriptions and what their responsibility is to be in the field. They need to have a schedule. I know we were in 5 states, and eventually I realized that I had to be in 5 states. I had to show up in the middle of the night in group homes and be with the staff in the community-based programs and be part of the team to help inspire and motivate them. We had numerous staff meetings that reflected our complex agency. So every level of the staff had their individual meetings, and they were, especially for the direct service people, they were all field-based. You know, we would meet in the church, we would meet at Starbucks, we would meet at the train station, at the mall. So that, well, one, it's much more efficient if the staff are out in the community for the managers to go to them. But it also, as a role model, that this is where they belong, that we're all in the community. You've got to provide the resources so that we can communicate. I know a lot of you use TheraAB. You can use that as a way to email each other. Have the iPhones, smartphones to keep in touch, to ask for help, to answer questions. And you've got to have ways to collect information. And we use TheraAB in the community, but there are a lot of other techniques you can use to collect information, and having direct service staff collect information rather than just the queue bringing it all together. But one of the key things for people who know me and have heard me speak before, and I'm assuming that most of the folk who are on this webinar are probably managers, leadership. With leadership, all things can be accomplished. And as Genni said, we had every obstacle. No one wanted us to be in the community. And tomorrow we'll talk more in depth about how we came to that decision about that we had to be in the community, because we didn't have all those laws in the 1980s that we just went through. We had a few, but we didn't have the settings rule. We didn't have a mandate. We were fighting everyone to do the right thing. Initially, you know, Genni came to me as a manager and said, we really need to change our ways and get out of this building and be in the community. And she changed our agency. She changed me. And my first reaction was, I've spent years building this business and our facilities. I had several multi-million-dollar buildings. I was buying group homes and putting people in it, and was very proud of it. And it was very threatening until she started taking me out into the field and showing me the dramatic changes it made in the lives of the people who I knew from the institution, who I had gotten out of the institution and put them in center-based activities and thought this was the end of it. But then I saw the dramatic changes in people's lives. And I realized it wasn't about me, and it's certainly not about you, and it's nothing to do with the building. So we moved this agency to 5 states, had over 900 staff, a $33 million budget, and we were in a very, we were in Washington, D.C., and had a very conservative board. And the key to our change was we redefined our mission, and we'll talk about that more tomorrow, and we became mission driven. Every decision we made had to do with, are we living up to this mission? We created a learning environment, not just for our participants of being in the community, but for our staff. And we used the staff, direct service staff, managers, parents, participants, to develop a team that did 99% of the problem solving of every issue moving forward. I know the tradition is usually the CEO makes really the hard decisions. You've got to trust your staff to identify the problems that are going to move you forward and to help you solve those problems. You've got to use that team to plan every aspect and do a cost analysis. We had a slogan early on of no margin, no mission. Though most of you are charities, not all of you, you cannot put yourself out of business. You've got to be able to pay for the services you render, which then takes you to advocacy. You've got to be together, work together as a collection of agencies. You've got to look at what are the challenges and the obstacles, and you've got to work together to voice those issues to the government agencies and to the other powers to be to help you resolve all of those issues moving forward. So with that, here's Genni.
So in summary, even though this is a difficult time, it's also a great time in that it's time for our advances towards acquisition of civil rights for people with disabilities. And this is the culmination of decades of work. And it's so important. Those of you who are older may know all of the progression towards where we are today, that it's occurred in the field. I've done this presentation to younger people who really didn't know that. So we've been moving to where we are now. Certainly we have a bump in the road with COVID-19 and other things, but this is the time. This is the time. Community integrated employment, meaningful community engagement, those things are the key to having people become included and valued as members of society, and to make those perceptions, changes in perception that will change the culture, and in which we all have a role in making that happen. And finally, I hope that you all do embrace and will continue to embrace, and you will communicate to others with whom you work, that this is a civil rights movement, that you are civil rights workers and change agents and advocates for people with disabilities. I hope you celebrate that role. I hope you recognize your power to promote change. It is a marvelous thing to be in a position where your work makes this kind of notable and profound change. So we are fortunate to be where we are. Again, today, what we wanted to do is just sort of give you the foundation, the background, the understanding of how we have evolved to where we are today. And tomorrow, as I said earlier, we're going to talk much more about the nuts and bolts, the how-tos. This is the why, and tomorrow is the how. There, as I said earlier, are no magic bullets here in terms of information about how to get back on track subsequent to COVID-19 or to the subsequent to the reopening of your state. But we have some ideas and some things that we can discuss, and we are talking to people in other states, so we do see things gradually moving back on track. Interestingly, I do think one of the things that is going to happen is that we're going to see less siloing of services in the future, because people having been in their residential supports significantly during this period, and now there is some question in many different localities about whether it makes sense for people to, leave their home and go to day programs all day. And there's many debates around those issues. We'll take up some of that tomorrow, but for today, just want to thank Suzanne and the folks at ICI for their support. Byron, always for your advocacy, and for the rest of you for your participation. So thank you. And please join us tomorrow.
We're going to do questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. And we do have time for some questions. Forgot that part. If there are any, and I don't know, Suzanne, how we will do that, if you unmute people or how that goes.
Genni and Tom, thank you so much. We can take a few moments here, folks, if you have questions. Along the bottom of your screen should be a black menu bar. If you click on chat, I see there are some folks who have found it. Why don't we go ahead and go through a couple of questions, Genni and Tom. And folks, if you think of other questions, please go ahead and type those in. If you'd like to verbally share them, you're certainly welcome to do so. You can click on the participant pod, click on the word participants, and along the bottom of that participant pod, you should see an option to click on yes. And you could let us know if you have a question. We can unmute your line. So first question, state policies need to incentivize the very patient work to provide supports for people with the most complex support needs for both community engagement and paid employment. What experiences do you have in transforming policies to make this happen? And again, maybe is that a question for tomorrow?
Well, it may be a question for tomorrow, and it may also be a question for government in terms of, what they have available there to be able to support people with more complex challenges to employment and more complex challenges to community engagement. But I will say this, that it is absolutely necessary to have the capability to provide funding at different levels for folks, because people with the greater acuity need more support, and that often translates into lower ratios and lower staff to individual ratios. I always say to people, we have to think one person at a time. And that's how we always function. So when people would ask me, well, what did you do with the people who were physically impaired? Well, they were all different. They weren't like one profile. So we just always took time to analyze person by person what that person wanted and for their lives, and how we could provide that. And often that did, as Tom mentioned earlier, mean that we had to do some pretty tough advocating individually for that person. So sort of on the macro level, it's having the capability to have your waiver programs or whatever your funding source is flexible enough that it will accommodate for people with higher acuity. And then on your side of the coin, at the provider level, you have to have the capability of being creative and innovative and extremely flexible and looking at people person by person.
And if I could add, on a wider scale, Genni was the president of the Virginia Association of Providers, and I was a past president for many years of the District of Columbia provider group. And we routinely, as we were moving out in the community, shared our thoughts with the other providers and met routinely with government And our meetings were really data-based of, you just can't go and say to the DD agency, I need more money. You need to come up with data to demonstrate that your resources that are being provided to you are insufficient, and you need to collect that in a consistent way across agencies. So you give the DD director or Voc Rehab or whoever it is you're talking to some information that they can take to the legislature. So, it's just not somebody saying, I need more money. I mean, everybody says that. You've got to demonstrate that you can't fulfill the mission under these circumstances. And I think that was the biggest way, the most important way of getting the agencies to work together to affect change.
Great, thank you both. And certainly for those who know of St. John's and all of the great work, you have left a wonderful legacy now as you're doing a different kind of work, but certainly still so many stories as useful examples, even in today's world. Another question here, and I'll also mention, Genni, if you and Tom want to drop your contact information into the chat space, I don't think it was on the flyer, but if you want to type in your email address, how you prefer to be contacted.
Yeah.
So there's a comment here about needing help in our agency world for creative funding strategies. And they go on to ask, what are your strategies for working with the most significantly challenged people? There's a lot in that question to unpack.
So it was asking both about the funding and the strategies for working with people with more complex challenges.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Can I start with the funding?
Sure.
We didn't have sufficient money when we started this, and we did a lot of fundraising, because think of yourself as just another business, like you're a McDonald's selling burgers, and suddenly you get the virus, and you can't do sit down anymore. It's all home delivery. I mean, this is where we are. We're moving from center-based to facility-based, or to community-based, I'm sorry. No one is really going to give you, the government's not going to give you sufficient dollars to make that model transition. That you've got to be a fairly self-sufficient business. You might pick up some dollars occasionally, and in the past, government gave you startup money for a variety of activities. But for the most part, those days are really gone. So we did a lot of fundraising. We ended up fundraising about $1 million a year. We hit every civic agency, every foundation, every other, giving charity we could. And we'll go into some of this tomorrow of creating an elevator speech and teaching your staff to go out and speak to community, not just to create community opportunities for your participants, but also to raise money for all of your startup costs and transition costs. And we'll also talk tomorrow about reallocating resources of, there's some things in your building that you don't need as you move into the community. Genni can talk about the more complex folk you deal with.
Well, I think, really I answered that pretty much in my earlier answer. We did very creative stuff. I mean, I think, again, it's looking at, and I always end up saying this, it's looking at the individual. One person we supported in Virginia, I recall, didn't have use of any of his limbs, had to be fed by a very careful protocol that had to be followed, very exactly. had to be changed during the day, and any number of obstacles to his full community participation. And we just rolled up our sleeves and started working with his group home to see, could we come by there sometimes to change him? Could we figure out, where there were restrooms in the community that were single handicap, room, bathrooms that we could sometimes change people in. I mean, we just sat down as a team, and if this person presented with these challenges, then we worked as hard as we could with as many people as we could. So that would probably be support coordination, that might be residential supports or home supports. Just kept at it till we figured out, a way. I often get asked by people, about people who have very complex medical conditions or very complex behavioral challenges, how to work with those individuals in the community. And I'm always going to say the very same thing. You're looking at an individual. What are the interests of that person? What are the support needs of that person? How are we going to weave together, using every resource we can find, a support plan for that person so they can participate to the fullest degree possible? It is possible that there are people whose medical complexity is such that they won't be in the community as much as maybe some other people will. But what I wouldn't want people to do is just automatically start ruling people out. This person's too complicated. This person has too many medical things. That's not necessary. It's really just looking at the individual, figuring out what they need, advocating like heck to get that support, and then taking it from there, reevaluating all along to make sure it's working well.
And sometimes it's simple accommodations. I was in doing a workshop in Ohio, and some of you have probably heard this story. And I was talking to a bunch of managers doing the workshop, and this one young manager broke down in tears about how she had a person in a wheelchair who all he wanted to do was go across the street to Starbucks and have a cup of coffee just like you or I would. And well, why can't you? I have 3 people in wheelchairs. It's like, you need to rethink how you group people and what accommodations and support you make. It's not always about the person's disability. It's, you've got to stop the silo, that here's all the people with wheelchairs have to be together. It doesn't have to be that way. And it's really about team planning. And tomorrow, Genni will go into a simple little assessment tool, a positive personal profile, where you look at each individual and what their interests and skills are.
I think that's sort of an interesting observation for both of you, as we're all thinking about coming out of shutdowns and things being closed, and the revelations that people have had, and the experiences that even if right now it's sort of coming through in anecdotal comments, that they're seeing fewer behaviors with individuals. They're recognizing that people are experiencing these new kinds of lifestyles that they like. And it's a very, very interesting way to say we now have new things to take into account when we're talking about supporting that person. Yes. We have new things to think about. They've shown us something new. The old adage of teaching old dogs new tricks. Yes, we all can learn things. And it's been through the oddest of circumstances, but here we are. We have new things to talk about and new observations, and people are teaching us things without even recognizing how critical that is now.
Yes, I think people are learning a great deal. As I said earlier, one of the things I'm hearing across the country that resonates is these silos, the silos, we're separating a person's life into pieces, and those pieces don't communicate with each other, and some services we're trying to fit people in really aren't correct for them. And we've got to learn how to be much more flexible, much more fluid, And we've learned a lot about flexibility and fluidity over the past few years. We'll talk a lot about scheduling and the complexity thereof tomorrow. But I think we're just going to see more and more complexity in terms of the individualization of services. And that is going to cause us to have the ability to have staff who are very versatile and who may be cross-trained and can do a number of different things to support people so that their life can be more natural and not, cut up into little pieces and siloed.
Oh, and I think too, just remember if you or I ended up coming to the same room, doing the same stuff every day for 20 years, I would be a major behavior problem. But
Amen. Yeah.
But you give people different experiences, that they haven't had before, that are exciting, that are new, that they've had some say in choosing what they're going to do this week. You'll see them in a whole different light. I remember when we opened a program in Tennessee that a young man got off the bus after their outing, and the staff was so excited that they knew this person for like 10, 15 years, and suddenly they saw a different person.
The technical thing, I can't find the chat box on my bar, so I don't know. Our information will be there tomorrow. I don't know if everybody's, or perhaps there's another way to share it. I don't know why the chat box is.
Sure. Yeah, we'll definitely get it out, and we'll share it also as a part of the third event too. Yeah, Genni, I'm going to stretch what you're saying even into the world that this will make Ree laugh, because we're digging our heels in on the silo between what happens during the day and what's considered residential. That you really can't have conversations about changing your overall funding strategy if you're not looking at the full budget and how you plan across all facets. So that's a topic for another day, but I hope that's not stretching your where you were going with your remark about the silos.
It absolutely is, and hi, Ree.
Yeah, for sure. So this has been wonderful. Thank you so much both for bringing your stories and your experiences and using that to help bring some energy to everyone in Alabama. We're going to be together again tomorrow at the same time. We're going to start at 1:30 Central. And I don't have, let's see, the title is Pathways to the Community, which is going to be great. So we hope everyone will come back tomorrow and bring colleagues. The recording will be shared. Byron will be getting out the location information for the site, the website, where all of that's going to be made available for everyone that either couldn't make it or who would like to listen again. So we'll be getting those files to him, and you can watch for those in the near future. Thank you both so much, and we're looking forward to another session tomorrow.
Yep. Us too. We'll see you then.
See you then. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.